This episode of the Imprint Weekly podcast is sponsored by Kemp Center. 4 days, 60 hours, 250 sessions, and 500 presenters, with an anticipated 3,000 change agents from around the world on a mission to change child welfare as we know it. Join us October 3rd through 6th, 2022, at the Kemp Center's International Virtual Call to Action Conference to Change Child Welfare. For more information, visit kempconference.org. That's KEMPE conference.org.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @theimprintnews. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. We are going with no guest this week. You just got me riffing for a little bit. This will be our final show in the month of August. We're going to take a few weeks off here to do some more guest interviews, and we will be back on September 12th with the next episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. So I thought today we would start with some headlines as usual and then pivot to a fall preview of sorts. I'm just going to share a few things we have our eye on the imprint as we head out of summer here. So first headline relates to a topic we have covered with two consecutive guests back in May on the podcast, and as the present day execution of child maltreatment registries. We had Scott Pham, then of BuzzFeed, on to talk about his data reporting around the issue. He found that millions of parents had been added to these state registries since 2008 and were often not told that they were on it. And even if they were told, they faced a mountainous climb to get off of the registry if that entry was in error. And then we had social work professor Colleen Henry of Hunter College on to talk about how these registries had morphed over the years from an internal tracking process for child welfare agencies into basically a staple part of background checks for a lot of human service jobs. I say state registries because there really isn't a national child abuse registry. There was some talk of one in the Adam Walsh Act, actually, maybe a decade ago, but that has not come to fruition or really moved at all. So the headline here is that a group of nonprofits and parents who have experienced the child welfare system in Pennsylvania have filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of their state's child abuse registry process. When a parent's name appears on the state's registry, which is known as the child line, they can be barred for life from employment opportunities, volunteering, adoption, being a foster parent, even when a judge has never confirmed allegations of child maltreatment. So the suit that was filed in Pennsylvania's Commonwealth Court accuses the state of subjecting thousands of its residents to, quote, the devastating long-term effects of being falsely identified as child abusers in violation of their constitutional rights. I'm going to link to reporter Michael Fitzgerald's great breakdown of this case, which I think might be a little bit of a precedent setter. There's definitely been legislative changes made to registry processes, notably in New York of late, where the limit was brought way down on how long a parent would be on a registry pursuant to a neglect case. And hit me up at tips@imprintnews.org if I'm wrong on this and you want to call me out. This might be the first formidable constitutional challenge in court of a statewide registry. Again, I could be wrong. I'd love to hear about it if I am. We can follow up on another episode. In California, a bill has been introduced that would bar police from lying to a youth during the course of an interrogation. Really, it's a little bit broader than that. Actually, they won't be able to use any manipulative tactics, including lying, but also threatening or even making it seem like the evidence they have is stronger than it really is. So if this passes, it would put California as the fourth state in about the span of a year to make this move. Illinois got the ball rolling in 2021. They were the first state, and Utah and Oregon have since followed. The Imprint's Farah Mina reported this month on a trend in Hennepin County, Minnesota, that I will be interested to see if it proves out as a broader national one as we get more post-pandemic data on child welfare. So Hennepin County is home to Minneapolis, as well as some of Minnesota's most populous suburbs, and it has seen the number of entries into foster care plummet since 2018. There were 1,208 kids in the county who entered foster care in 2018. That was down to 1,000 before the pandemic hit, and now it's all the way down to 604 entries for 2021. Now, we all know that the earliest stanza of the pandemic created some downward pressure of its own on child safety investigating, with challenges to the workforce and social isolation measures, lowering the flow of reports to hotlines, and more. But Hennepin County's leader, Kwesi Booker, said in a recent report of child welfare outcomes that, quote, while the reduced volume during the pandemic is a factor, the trend also demonstrates the county's commitment to child and family well-being. So entries are way down, Mina reported, but so are reunifications of children to their parents from foster care. 59% of the kids who exited Hennepin County foster care in 2018 were reunified with their parents. They exited the system to go back home. In 2021, that was just 44%. So a very, very big drop off, 15 percentage points. So what's the reason? The Hennepin County report said, and I'm quoting here, it could be more deeply entrenched issues like access to services or severity of dynamics that brought children into care, or it could also be simple association with fewer kids entering care, or a short-term trend that will reverse as the pandemic eases. Now, child welfare expert John Mattingly put the latter option more directly to Mina in the story. Quote, if you are removing fewer children, then the ones that you remove should stay in care because they're more serious cases. It is, at least as a short-term proposition, somewhat logical that if you were taking more children than you needed to into foster care, and then you took intentional steps to lower foster care usage, the children who did enter care would be the ones with more complicated circumstances and thus be less likely to exit to reunification ever, or in the short term at least. But over time, you would hope that with less kids in the system, the investments in reunification for the ones that were in foster care would improve and thus restore a higher reunification rate. Now, Dee Wilson, who was on our podcast earlier this month, is a big proponent of this, really leaning into more financial and service supports around reunification. So what will happen in Hennepin County? I took a look at recent outcomes for New Jersey out of curiosity when I was thinking about this, because they have seen on a state level what Hennepin has here on the county level, and that is a pronounced decrease in entries and in the overall number of kids in foster care. There were about 7,000 kids in New Jersey's foster care in 2014. By 2020, that was down to under 4,000. So in 2016, of the youth who exited foster care in New Jersey, 56% did so to reunification, as was the case in 2018 as well. But then it dropped to 54% in 2019 and all the way to 47% in 2020. So Hennepin had a similar pattern basically a year further out. The reunification rate dropped a little bit, and then in 2021, it dropped a lot of it, way down to 44%. Another data point, recent national foster care data suggests there's a strong inverse connection between entries and reunification. The national outcomes in terms of foster care exits had forever, or at least since annual federal data was collected, shown that more than half of youth who exited foster care were reunified. It remains the most frequent exit circumstance, but in 2017, the percentage of exits to reunification dropped below 50% for the first time in recorded history, so going back to at least the 1990s, and it hasn't gone back to the half line since. It actually reached as low as 47% pretty recently. And I think that this is probably the least discussed trend in child welfare data. I'm not sure why. Now, 2017 was not a down year for foster care use. It was actually the recent peak. There were 442,000 kids in care nationally, but it would prove to mark the top of the most recent spike, and it was also a year in which entries into foster care started to decline from a very sharp rise between 2012 and 2016. Anyway, Bottom line, as we have discussed before, the early going of the pandemic definitely contributed to a decrease in entries to foster care in almost every state. And now the question is whether we're going to see the use of foster care snap back up. And if not, whether states can improve on reunification outcomes with the more complex cases that they have. Let's switch gears from some interesting state stuff to the national level, and we begin with an interesting resolution released by the DC-based American Bar Association. Resolution 606, which was written by the recently retired New Orleans judge Ernestine Gray, calls on all bar associations in the country to educate attorneys about, and I am quoting from the resolution, anti-Black systemic racism within the child welfare system stemming from the history of slavery in the United States and perpetuated by over-surveillance of and under-investment in Black families in America, which is pervasive, ongoing, and a root cause of the disproportionate involvement of Black parents and children within the system. The resolution presents a case for the idea that in post-slavery America, laws were frequently written that directly permitted racial discrimination in a way that jeopardized Black families and encouraged or at least propelled states and counties to use foster care and family separation on them in a disproportionate fashion. And that those policies gave way to a more modern slate of child welfare laws that are not discriminatory on their face, but have nonetheless contributed to continued racial disproportionality and disparity in child welfare. Among the present-day laws that the ABA identifies as problematic, at least in part, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, and the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. I think this resolution stops short of apologizing for ABA's involvement in supporting such policies, but does convey a feeling of complicity, I guess, conceding that the organization has, I'm going to quote here from it, traditionally supported and helped design pieces of legislation that have disproportionately affected and caused harm to Black children, parents, and families. Recognizing the discriminatory effect of these laws requires that the legal profession stand up and do something to change them. Even if these results arose from well-intended laws, no profession should turn a blind eye once the consequences are clear. Late last month, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention released estimated data on youth arrests in 2020, and it shows a rather precipitous decline from 2019. There were about 424,000 youth arrests made in 2020. That is down 38% from 2019, and that included continued decline in motor vehicle theft, robbery, and aggravated assault. There was no change in arrests for homicides or manslaughter from 2019, and it remains up about 10% from where it was in 2016. So this data tracks, I guess, with what the Annie E. Casey Foundation has found deeper into the juvenile justice process during 2020. The Casey Foundation, through its work with juvenile justice systems around the country, has really good ties to a lot of them and was able to kind of extract, regularly reported data about the use of detention during the pandemic. It was very helpful because we didn't have a lot of intel at all to kind of get a sense of what was going on. And so what their numbers showed was during 2020, the number of youth entering detention centers plummeted in the early going. But more recent data they've collected shows those declines have largely been erased already. And so it will be interesting to see whether the 2021 youth arrest estimates from the Department of Justice do the same thing. The Justice Department also released a pretty interesting bulletin just before we recorded this. So I'm not going to talk much about it today since I want to go through it a little more in depth. But this study followed a cohort of 160,000 people born in the year 2000, to trace their experience with juvenile court referrals. So I'll link to it in the show notes for people who want to read. But top line, it found that about 1 in 8 youth from that birth cohort were referred to juvenile court at least once. So this is very shoddy math, but I looked it up, and there's, about 4 million kids born in the United States in 2000. So figure 487,000 of them were referred to juvenile court. And of that group, the other top line finding here, the vast majority, 63%, did not ever find themselves in that position being referred to juvenile court again. So again, I'll drop the link for people that want to read up. Maybe we'll get a guest on here to talk a little bit more in depth about all the different things they find, or I'll just break it down. All right, we'll take a quick break for a read here and then come back with 5 things to keep an eye on this fall.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
All right, as I mentioned, just me today. We'll be back to our regular format in early September. We've done some headlines from recent weeks. Let's now take a look at 5 things that either could come up or will come up this fall when it comes to federal law and policy on youth and families. First, and this will definitely happen, is the Supreme Court will hear a constitutional challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act that has been heading to the court since 2018. It's called Brackeen v. Holland, and it originated in a federal district court in Texas, where a judge ruled ICWA to be race-based and thus subject to strict scrutiny rules, and that it was unconstitutional on several grounds, including that it compelled the states to carry out federal law, which is called anti-commandeering. The appeals court for the Fifth Circuit disagreed and upheld that ICWA overall is constitutional and that it is a political law predicated on agreements with tribes and not a racial law. But the Fifth Circuit did deliver an opinion where some provisions of ICWA were struck down at that circuit level or at the lower district level. It's like 300 pages and very confusing. And at that point, the Supreme Court stepped in and granted cert in the case at the request of both the petitioners and the respondents. The date for the court to hear the Brackeen case is November 9th, and major briefs to the court in this case are already rolling in. I'll drop a link in the show notes for people who want to go read up on the briefs, and I'll also drop, a link to a kind of a tagged collection of our ICWA coverage from the past few years at the imprint. I think there was always some trepidation about this case as it moved towards the high court, and I've certainly sensed that more people feel like ICWA is doomed in the wake of the Supreme Court's recent decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, which was another law from the 1970s. The way the case is set up, the court can consider really everything from a pretty minor ruling all the way up to getting rid of ICWA altogether or really gutting it. I think the questions that the 9 justices asked during those oral arguments on November 9th will certainly give some indication of where their heads are at in terms of what's at stake. Just 2 further points on this, though. The last big child welfare case that the Supreme Court took on, Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, also could have led to a massive shift in federal law. That case was over the city's refusal to work with a faith-based provider that wouldn't serve same-sex couples. So many people thought that it could spell the end of Employment Division v. Smith, which is a long-time precedent that state and local governments could require faith-based entities to follow laws that are generally applicable and don't target religious practice. Instead, the court in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia came to a pretty narrowly tailored and actually unanimous decision. Second point, there is perhaps this assumption that the subject of ICWA is one split by the ideology associated with each justice in the fashion that, the Roe v. Wade decision was. But that might not be the case. For one thing, Justice Neil Gorsuch has been quite a vociferous defender of tribes and their rights in previous cases since joining the court, whereas retired Justice Stephen Breyer voted with a conservative majority in limiting the role of ICWA in the 2013 Baby Veronica case, and opposing that conservative majority was a dissent from Justice Antonin Scalia, who would never be confused with a liberal justice. Second on our list for the fall here would be some sort of federal guidance shift around the ability of state child welfare agencies to get listed as a payee for the Social Security benefits that foster youth are sometimes eligible for. So this includes death benefits for youth whose parents have died and disability benefits or monthly cash payments to help meet the basic needs of children who have a physical or mental disability or who are blind. As a recent investigation by the Marshall Project put on full display, states have been getting themselves listed as a recipient for those payments, and in many cases, not all, using the money to simply offset the everyday costs of foster care. So they're not saving the money for the child for when they turn 18, nor are they spending it on supports above and beyond what any foster youth would get. As we mentioned recently on the podcast, the Biden administration just initiated a kind of a 180 on federal policy when it comes to states using child support payments to help offset the cost of foster care. And we have heard that similar action could be coming on this issue of child benefits, perhaps jointly from the Administration for Children and Families, which oversees child welfare policy, and the Social Security Administration, which manages these disability and death benefits. Third thing to watch would be the reauthorization process for two federal child welfare-related programs. First is the Mary Lee Allen Promoting Safe and Stable Families program, which is named retroactively after Mary Lee Allen, who's a longtime child welfare advocate for the Children's Defense Fund. That program is part of Title 4B, and much of the money sent to states for family preservation work or reunification services, child welfare court improvement comes out of there. Small side note on that, we have heard that a new bill that calls for federal tracking and reporting on foster care capacity, which was recently introduced by Senators Chuck Grassley and Maggie Hassan, could be part of that reauthorization if it moves along. I will post our story on that bill that was proposed by Grassley and Hassan. It's somewhat interesting in that it could theoretically add a third annual data contribution from the feds along with the AFCARS report every year that reflects on how many youth are in foster care and where they are and termination of parental rights and other things. And then the child maltreatment report, which generally gives an indication of how many hotline reports there were, substantiated abuse and neglect, how often foster care was used in those cases. So that's the Mary Lee Allen program. The other one up for reauthorization is the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting program, which is often just kind of shortened to MICV. That program puts $400 million out there to states to help pay for approved models of home visiting programs. And generally, if you have not heard of those, these are models of service where trained professionals go out to the homes of new or expecting parents to help with the preparation and adjustment. So one of the more popular and well-known ones is the Nurse Family Partnership that pairs up new expecting moms with nurses who go into the home before and after the baby is born. MICV is a little more pressing, I think, of the two in the way that it works because the money for home visiting will run out at the end of September unless there's action on this. So this happened a few years back. The last time MICV was due for reauthorization, it got pretty hairy. There were definitely local programs that were either halting new clients from getting in or preparing to let home visiting staff go. And then the program got a full reauthorization kind of at the last minute in actually the same stopgap kind of funding bill to prevent a government shutdown that saw the passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act, and that was all back in 2018. All right, fourth item to watch for the fall. I'm going to guess something like this would really only come in the form of a spending bill. Now, who knows if we'll get spending bills for the fiscal year in the fall or if it'll take longer than that. But I wouldn't be shocked to see somebody in Congress carry the torch for, a human services workforce stabilization fund. There continue to be red lights flashing around workforce recruitment and retention in lots of critical parts of the safety net. This is everything from teachers to mental health workers and certainly frontline workers in child welfare and juvenile justice. I think that probably the most blaring red light would be the situation inside of Texas's juvenile facilities, where it has gotten so bad that they have cut off counties from sending kids for the most part because they just don't have enough workers showing up to accommodate as many youth as they could. And there are pretty credible reports of kids being restricted to their rooms almost all day because there aren't enough workers to safely have the facility more open. So that's just one example, obviously, and a pretty bad one. But, obviously some of the job numbers that have come in July are fairly promising. I still continue to hear and read headlines from people all over the country about the serious deficit they have in filling jobs that are critical to the front lines of everything from just child protection to child welfare frontline services, and same goes for juvenile justice. And then a final thing to look out for in the fall, the AFCARS report. I mentioned it before, but AFCARS stands for the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. There's a report put out by the feds each year that will probably be published in the late fall. I've seen it come as early as late August, but more often you're talking about October or November. Everyone knew that the 2020 AFCARS report was going to show a decline in foster care. It just had to, given how much reporting of abuse and neglect had gone down for a very prolonged period after March of 2020. But it was a big drop, and it was consistent across almost every state. And when combined with the child maltreatment data that was released later on 2020, which found that there was no big change in maltreatment deaths and really a decline in substantiated abuse neglect, that painted a pretty positive picture of child safety in an otherwise volatile period of the country's history. Now, the 2021 report will show us to some extent how much of an aberration it all was, because while the pandemic and reporting was a big influence for sure, there's also been tremendous momentum and advocacy for reducing the role of foster care in particular and child welfare altogether. So I wouldn't say that sustained declines in foster care totals for 2021 is like an airtight case that this campaigning has had an impact, but it would certainly be an indicator that it's more than just a pandemic reaction or a pendulum swing. Now, there's an outside chance we'll also get the child maltreatment data from 2021 in the fall, but more likely that's going to show up in early winter. All right, that is it for this week's episode. Thanks for joining us for the Imprint Weekly Podcast, which is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voice program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always reach us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you in September.